Imagine this. You stand in a palace of mirrors and silk, where chandeliers drip with candlelight, where velvet curtains breathe with a draft of secret corridors. Gold glimmers everywhere, on goblets, on crowns, on the embroidered hems of gowns, so heavy they drag like chains across marble floors. Courtiers whisper like snakes coiled in shadow, and at the center of this glittering theater sits the king. His face is pale with illness, but his hand trembles toward a small vial, stoppered in glass, filled with something so fine, so dark, that it looks almost like ashes of the dead. And in truth, it is. You watch as the king's physician grinds the powder of a human skull into wine. The smell is earthy, metallic, unsettlingly familiar, like iron in damp soil. The monarch lifts the cup with solemnity, drinks deeply, and sighs as if swallowing not death, but life itself. Around him, nobles nod in approval. They, too, have tasted such remedies. Tinctures made from human fat, powders from bones, the preserved flesh of ancient mummies smuggled from Egypt and sold for gold in the apothecaries of London and Paris. This is not a barbarian rite performed in caves or by blood-mad tribes in distant lands. This is Europe in the age of refinement, when kings wore silk stockings, when philosophers debated reason and enlightenment, when the world was supposedly being tamed by civilization. And yet, in these very palaces, behind the masks of civility, rulers consumed human flesh in the belief that it might cure their pain, prolong their lives, and grant them power over death itself. If that image unsettles you, good, hold on to the unease, for it is the thread that will lead us through this labyrinth of shadows. And before we dive deeper, remember, back-end index pointing right. If you like uncovering the hidden truths of history, click like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. This story is one of those that once heard, cannot be forgotten. The practice was called medical cannibalism, and it was not rare. From the 16th to the 18th century, Europe's nobility consumed human remains as medicine. Powdered mummy imported from Egypt was sold in apothecaries like saffron or cinnamon. Human skull was ground into dust and mixed into spirits to treat headaches and epilepsy. King Charles II of England kept a personal tincture of distilled human skull, which he called his king's drops. French royalty purchased fat scraped from the bodies of executed criminals, believing it could cure wounds when rubbed into the skin. Even in the lofty halls of the Vatican, remedies derived from human bone circulated under the blessing of learned physicians. Think of the contradiction. On one hand, Europe painted itself as the shining heir of Rome and Greece, a continent of reason, progress, and divine order. On the other, its kings, queens, and scholars eagerly devoured the remains of the dead like desperate alchemists, masking their cannibalism with Latin words and medical treatises. They whispered of virtue and salvation, even as they raised cups laced with the dust of the grave. The origins of this obsession lie in Egypt. European merchants, dazzled by the strange, embalmed corpses of ancient pharaohs, carried fragments of mummies back to Venice and Paris. Apothecaries discovered that the black resin sealing those bodies could be ground into powder and sold as a cure for everything from stomach aches to plague. Soon, demand outstripped supply. By the 17th century, counterfeit mummies filled European markets. Criminals, beggars, and slaves were dismembered, their flesh dried in ovens, their bones powdered to mimic the relics of the Nile. The wealthy, sipping their remedies, seldom knew or cared whether they drank the essence of an Egyptian king or a hanged thief from the Paris gallows. And so you find yourself wandering through the courts of Europe, watching monarchs indulge in a ritual that reeks of desperation. The velvet drapes cannot hide the stench. The marble floors, polished to perfection, still echo with the groans of the executed, whose bodies were carved into medicine. Here is Louis XIV of France, radiant in the Hall of Mirrors, taking a draught said to contain the blood of a young man freshly killed. There is an English duke, pale with gout, smearing human fat upon his legs as though it were perfume. In Prague, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II surrounds himself with jars of powdered bone, chasing immortality in a palace filled with skulls disguised as remedies. To walk in these palaces is to walk in paradox. You see chandeliers above and hear whispers below. You see gowns shimmering like firelight and smell the sickly sweetness of decay ground into powder. The kings believe they are feasting on life. But what you witness is the banquet of shadows, a communion of power and flesh, where crowns are stained not with blood spilled in battle, but with blood swallowed in silence. And that is only the beginning. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow streets of 17th century London. The air stinks of fish guts and horse dung, of smoke from coal fires, of humanity crammed too tightly together. But if you follow the winding alleys into the heart of the city, you reach a different kind of market, a place where the stalls sell powders not of spice, but of death. Apothecaries here are crowded, dimly lit shops, their shelves stacked high with jars of strange substances. Cinnamon and cloves from the Indies, dried lizards, crushed emeralds, and most prized of all, a substance labeled mumia. You lean closer. The label tells you it is ground from the preserved flesh of ancient Egyptian mummies. Rich men send their servants here to purchase it by the ounce. Women of noble blood add it to their wine when they feel faint. Physicians prescribe it to the wealthy as a cure for headaches, bleeding, and melancholy. But what the jars really contain is uncertain. Sometimes the powder is truly ancient, stolen from tombs along the Nile. More often, it is the dried remains of thieves and paupers roasted in ovens, their bones ground fine and sold as relics of pharaohs. You realize with a chill that death has become a commodity, measured in weights, wrapped in paper, handed over across a counter like sugar or flour. Apothecaries were not the only suppliers. Execution grounds became harvest fields. When a man was hanged at Tyburn in London or broken on the wheel in Paris, crowds came not just to witness his suffering, but to gather his body's remains. The poor dipped rags into the blood of the freshly killed, drinking it warm as a cure for epilepsy. The wealthy sent servants to bribe the executioner, buying jars of fat sliced from the condemned. Physicians recorded in their notebooks that human fat, applied to the skin, could soothe wounds, gout, and joint pain. In Germany, skulls were collected, polished, and powdered for medicines. Executioners became reluctant pharmacists. For an extra coin, they scraped grease from corpses, boiled bones, and delivered bottles of blood to the homes of nobles. These men, feared by all, suddenly held a strange kind of power. They were the gatekeepers to the most sought-after medicine in Europe, human life, distilled into fragments. Picture yourself in an apothecary in Paris. The shelves groan with glass vials, powdered bone, fragments of skull, dried liver. A physician whispers that these substances are not vulgar cannibalism, but refined medicine. The body, he argues, contains a vital spirit. By consuming that spirit, one can take into oneself the strength of the dead. You watch as a nobleman enters, pale with sickness, his hand shaking. The apothecary takes down a jar, taps out a spoonful of powder, what he calls cranium humanum, and mixes it into wine. The man drinks, wincing at the bitter taste, and leaves a heavy purse behind. Outside, the streets swarm with beggars who will never taste such remedies. though their own bodies may one day be sold as medicine for the rich. This is the moral paradox you cannot escape. The palace feasts on the flesh of the gallows. Kings sip the essence of thieves. The blood of the poor circulates through the veins of princes. Civilization, gilded and refined, sustains itself with a hunger darker than any jungle ritual. Even the most exalted rulers were not exempt. In England, King Charles II himself ordered a special tincture made from powdered skull steeped in alcohol. He called it the King's Drops, a potion he trusted more than any physician. Across the Channel, French queens smeared human fat on their skin, hoping it would keep them youthful. In Prague, the eccentric Emperor Rudolph II filled his palace with alchemists who supplied him with bones, blood, and flesh disguised as cures. What unites them all is desperation. Monarchs, who commanded armies and bent nations to their will, were powerless against sickness and death. And so they turned to the most forbidden of remedies. You see them in their chambers, crowns set aside, drinking from cups that reek faintly of the grave. It is a grotesque masquerade. Velvet gowns, golden chalices, powdered wigs, and inside the cup, death itself. You leave the market with the smell still clinging to your clothes, a sickly blend of spice and decay, of cinnamon masking rot, of roses perfuming blood. The apothecary shutters close behind you, but the whispers of this trade echo everywhere, from London to Paris, from Madrid to Rome. And in that echo you hear the truth. The palaces of Europe were not just theaters of light and music. They were also banquets of shadows, where kings and queens feasted, quite literally, on their subjects. And still, darker secrets wait. Imagine standing in the private chambers of Whitehall Palace. The corridors outside bustle with courtiers, but in here the air is heavy, thick with the smell of damp herbs and heated metal. The king lies restless in his bed, pale with fever. His lips tremble as he whispers for the one thing he trusts more than any doctor, the King's Drops. You watch as servants approach with a crystal decanter. Within it swirls a dark amber liquid, brandy infused with ground human skull. The preparation is solemn, almost sacred. The physician bows low before offering the draught, as though administering communion. Charles II, monarch of England, presses the vessel to his lips. The liquid touches his tongue, bitter and metallic, like rust dissolved in fire. He drinks slowly, his throat convulsing, then sinks back into the pillows with a sigh of relief. Around him, courtiers murmur in reverence. They believe, as he believes, that within those drops lies life itself, strength stolen from the dead, distilled into a king's salvation. This is no isolated eccentricity. In France, across the Channel, you find a queen rubbing a salve made of human fat into her temples, praying it will soothe her migraines. In the Holy Roman Empire, Rudolph II surrounds himself with jars of powdered bone and strange phials of dry blood, convinced they will grant him vigor and perhaps immortality. The paradox grows sharper. These are not starving peasants clutching at superstition. These are rulers surrounded by physicians, scholars, alchemists, the best minds of Europe. Yet when pain gnaws at their flesh, when death presses cold fingers against their throat, they reach not for reason, but for ritual. And the ritual is cannibalism in silk gloves. You move through the palaces, and everywhere the pattern repeats. A noblewoman in Paris is prescribed powdered mummy for her fainting fits. She stirs the black dust into her wine and drinks with trembling hands, her jewels clinking against the goblet. An English duke, tormented by gout, smears the rendered fat of executed criminals on his legs as though it were balm of roses. In Bavaria, a young prince swallows drops of blood collected from the scaffold, believing it will shield him from seizures. Each act is accompanied by solemnity, by prayers, by the illusion of science. But behind the curtains, you hear the whispers. Where did this body come from? Who was killed to provide this blood, this bone, this flesh? No one asks too loudly. The nobility feasts on shadows, but prefers not to see the faces of those they consume. The physicians justify it all. They write in Latin, cloaking their prescriptions in learned phrases. They speak of vital spirit residing in the blood, of marrow as a storehouse of strength, of resin-soaked mummy as nature's preservative. To them, consuming human remains is not barbarism. It is medicine supported by ancient authority and modern experiment alike. And the kings believe because they want to believe. Power is fragile. Behind the crowns and coronations, rulers live in constant fear of illness, of weakness, of mortality. They command nations, yet their bodies betray them. What greater terror could a king face than the thought that he is no different from the beggar who dies coughing in the gutter? And so they cling to anything, no matter how gruesome, that promises life. Picture Charles II again. He calls for his king's drops, not just in sickness, but in daily routine, sipping from the decanter like a man taking communion. He believes the skull, ground and steeped in alcohol, gives him clarity of mind. His courtiers nod and follow his example, some secretly disgusted, others genuinely convinced. The ritual spreads from the monarch's chamber to the homes of nobles, to the hands of wealthy merchants, until powdered skull and mummy become staples of European medicine. And always, the illusion of refinement masks the truth. Golden goblets carry the dust of the dead. Perfumed hands smear the fat of criminals. Palace chambers, echoing with music and laughter, conceal cupboards stocked with human remains. What do you feel standing there among them? Horror? Fascination? Or perhaps recognition? The realization that beneath the velvet and silk, the hunger of kings is no different from the hunger of beasts. They, too, will devour whatever promises survival. The court musicians strike their lutes in the next room. The perfume of roses drifts on the air. And yet in the king's hand is a cup that smells faintly of a graveyard. This is the secret face of royalty. Crowns polished above, skull dust below. And the deeper you go, the darker it becomes. Imagine yourself in the crowd at Tyburn Hill, London. The year is 1663. The air is damp with mist, and thousands press shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the condemned to appear. You hear the mutter of voices, the cries of street vendors selling pies, the creak of the gallows. For most, this is entertainment, a grim theater where life ends in spectacle. But for others, it is something more. For them, the execution ground is not a stage of justice, but a pharmacy. The condemned is dragged forward, pale, trembling, the noose tightened around his throat. He prays. The priest whispers absolution. The crowd jeers. And then, with a snap, the body jerks. Gasps, cheers, murmurs. But before the corpse has even gone still, the real ritual begins. Women rush forward with clay mugs, thrusting them toward the executioner. He takes a knife, slices into the body, and lets the blood run. Warm, steaming, thick. The women drink it down, crimson staining their lips. They believe it cures epilepsy, that the seizures which twist their bodies will vanish with the swallowing of another man's life. Physicians have endorsed this cure. Preachers have half condemned, half tolerated it. You stand close enough to smell the iron tang of the blood, to hear the gagging coughs of those who drink too quickly. Some faint, some cry out with ecstasy. The body swings above them, a grotesque sacrament. This practice was not confined to England. In Germany, executioners were respected suppliers of medicine. They collected blood, skulls, and fat, selling them to physicians who prescribed the remedies to nobles and kings. Powdered skulls were believed to stop nosebleeds. Fat was rubbed into wounds. Blood was swallowed fresh or dried into powders for later use. The executioner became not only the hand of justice, but the apothecary of the dead. Men feared him in life, but sought him in sickness. A knock at his door meant you were desperate enough to buy a vial of blood drained from a thief or a salve made of human fat rendered from a hanged man. The paradox is cruel. The same society that despised criminals in life made their bodies precious in death. Picture Paris, early 1600s. At the place to grieve, a young man is broken on the wheel. His limbs snap under the iron bar. His screams echo across the square. When at last silence falls, the crowd surges forward. Blood drips from his shattered body. A nobleman's servant elbows his way through, offering silver coins to the executioner. The man nods, fills a flask, and the servant slips away. That flask will be delivered to a townhouse where a baron lies shaking with seizures. By nightfall, the blood of a murdered man will be on his lips, praised as holy medicine. And it was not just the blood. The fat of the executed was boiled into ointments. Apothecary manuals of the time contain recipes, unguentum hominis, human grease applied to aching joints. In some cities, candles made of human fat were burned in rituals believed to drive away evil spirits. Skulls were collected, their bone ground into powder to cure headaches, or carved into goblets for nobles who believed drinking from them strengthened the spirit. Now return to the scaffold. Imagine the contrast. The jeering mob, the swing of the rope, the clatter of coins into the executioner's hand. To one side, a peasant woman gulps blood from a mug. To the other, a servant fills a vial to deliver to a palace. Two worlds, divided by wealth, united by desperation, drinking from the same source. The scaffold is a mirror. It reflects the savagery of the street and the refinement of the court. One in rags, one in silk, but both bound to the corpse as if it were an altar. What does it mean, you wonder, that civilization itself was nourished by such rites? The kings who dined on golden platters depended on the gallows for their medicine. The peasants who prayed in churches still fought through crowds to drink blood like animals. At the very foundation of Europe's grandeur lies this truth. Death was eaten, swallowed, consumed. And in this ritual, everyone was equal. The noble woman rubbing fat into her temples and the beggar drinking blood at the scaffold shared the same grotesque hope, that by devouring the dead, they could escape the grave. The executioner wipes his blade. The crowd disperses. The body is carted away. But in your mind, the image lingers. A noble palace nourished by the blood that drips from a common gallows. And as the centuries pass, the practice does not die. It only moves deeper into the palaces, into the chambers of kings. Imagine the long galleries of Versailles at dusk, their mirrors catching the last fire of the sun, the marble floors glowing faintly beneath your feet. You hear laughter, rustle of silk, the click of heels. Yet behind the gilded doors of the king's private chambers, the air is heavy, hushed, and filled with a smell that does not belong, an odor of iron, dust, and resin, like the open tomb of a pharaoh. You step inside. Louis XIV, the Sun King, sits at a carved desk. He is magnificent in his brocade, but his face is etched with pain. The physician beside him stirs a small draught, powdered mummy mixed with wine. The king raises the cup, steady despite his illness, and drinks. He does not grimace. He believes. He believes that the preserved flesh of an Egyptian corpse carries within it the secrets of eternity, that by consuming it he steals a fragment of immortality for himself. And outside, The fountains roar, the gardens blaze with torchlight, the court dances, unaware or unwilling to admit that their godlike king feasts on the dust of the dead. England offers no less chilling a scene. Picture Charles II at Whitehall, surrounded by courtiers and alchemists. He calls for his king's drops, a tincture of human skull distilled in alcohol. He drinks it not only for sickness, but for clarity, for strength. To him, it is no vulgar cannibalism, but a sacrament, medicine blessed by reason and necessity. His courtiers follow, some eagerly, others hiding their disgust behind masks of obedience. This is the heart of the paradox. Men who ruled continents, who commanded fleets and armies, reduced to trembling over a vial of bone dust. Kings who believed themselves chosen by God turned to the gallows and the grave for their salvation. The practice was not confined to these two monarchs. In Denmark, King Christian IV's court purchased powdered skull as a cure for melancholy. In the German states, nobles demanded mumia vera, true mummy, imported from Egypt or counterfeited from executed criminals. Even in the papal court of Rome, remedies made from human remains circulated, whispered of but seldom condemned outright. These kings and queens wrapped their cannibalism in silk words. They spoke of medicine, of ancient wisdom, of vital spirits. They quoted Galen, Dioscorides, and Paracelsus. They believed that consuming the body of another could restore what was broken in themselves. And yet, beneath the velvet and Latin phrases, the truth is stark. Royalty devoured the poor. The bodies came from gallows and plague pits, from tombs plundered in the East, from criminals boiled and dried in apothecary ovens. The high dined on the low, the powerful fed on the powerless. Imagine the banquet table at Versailles. Silver platters overflow with roasted pheasants, golden goblets brim with burgundy. Laughter rings as courtiers gossip, masks of wit and charm hiding their desperation. Yet you know that later, in the silence of his chamber, the king will swallow a medicine made from the blood of a thief or the bone of a hanged man. Picture the coronation of a French dauphin. Trumpets blare, incense fills the cathedral, nobles bow their heads. And in the king's pocket, wrapped in silk, is a vial of powdered mummy, his private shield against sickness, carried with as much reverence as the crown itself. Do you see it now? The contrast is unbearable. Chandeliers blazing with light, mirrored halls stretching into infinity, music echoing through gilded ceilings, and hidden beneath it, the silence of graves, the scent of old bones. Royalty believed they were communing with eternity, drinking fragments of immortality. But what you witness is hunger, raw, desperate, terrified hunger. A king may command nations, but he cannot command his own body. He cannot banish death, and so he eats it instead. The mask of civilization cracks here. You stand in the palace of the Sun King, or in Whitehall with the merry monarch, and you see it, crowns polished above, blood swallowed below. A banquet of shadows disguised as medicine. And the story does not end here. For the trade that fed kings spread across Europe, into apothecaries, markets, even the private cabinets of scholars and scientists. The dead had become Europe's most profitable harvest.